Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is TVP World. You're watching World News. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and these are the latest headlines. Poland's new President Karol Nawrocki has vowed to bring about constitutional change in the country as he pledged a Eurosceptic Poland First agenda after being sworn into office earlier today. Addressing both houses of the Polish parliament, the new head of state laid out a vision in which the president drives policy rather than act as a check of government power, setting him at odds with the ruling coalition.
Obejmując z woli narodu urząd prezydenta Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej,
Karol Tadeusz Nawrocki is sworn in as President of the Republic of Poland. In his inaugural speech, the new head of state delivered a firm message on immigration, the European Union, and judicial reform.
I will therefore be the voice of those who want a sovereign Poland, a Poland that is in the European Union, but a Poland that is not the European Union, but is and will remain Poland.
He pledged to crack down on illegal migration and stake to claim on the country's fiscal policy.
Plan 21 and my program say no to illegal migration, yes to the Polish zloty, and no to the euro. As President of Poland, I will not allow the retirement age for men and women to be raised.
Nawrocki, who was backed by the right-wing opposition Law and Justice Party, secured victory over the centrist Civic Coalition candidate by the narrowest of margins. He vowed to introduce constitutional change.
Recently, the Polish constitution has been violated so regularly that we, as the political class, must begin working on solutions for a new constitution that will be ready for adoption, I hope and believe, in 2030.
His campaign was weighed down by controversy. Nawrocki was accused of acquiring an apartment from an elderly man under questionable terms and allegedly facilitating escort services during his earlier work in hotel security, claims he denies. He also openly admitted to participating in hooligan fights. Nawrocki's approach sets him against the ruling coalition from the off, potentially spelling a rough cohabitation between Poland's president and its government.
This is not the first time I, as Prime Minister, have listened to a presidential speech. And this was also the case with previous presidents. I have heard this sort of speech before, one where you can very much hear a desire to have the competencies that the Prime Minister and government wield in the Polish political system. The constitution, to which President Nawrocki referred to repeatedly in his speech, is unambiguous on this issue.
John Todd, TVP World.
U.S. presidential envoy Steve Witkoff has held a 3-hour meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, which the Kremlin described as, quote, constructive. The talks come just days ahead of a Friday deadline set by Donald Trump for Russia to take steps towards peace in Ukraine. Joining me now is our correspondent Alex Hatier in Kyiv. So Alex, how has this meeting been received in Ukraine?
Well, it'll be received with a certain degree of skepticism, it has to be said. You can imagine that the officials in the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry behind me will be raising some eyebrows, particularly because if you think of the last meeting between Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin back in April, only saw the following months with escalations of Russian strikes on this city, on other civilian populations in this country, particularly Steve Witkoff himself, for many Ukrainians, not seen as a particularly serious broker, but nevertheless there will be some cause for optimism in the changing posture of the United States when it comes to Russia's full-scale invasion of this country. Now, we know the Kremlin, as you quite rightly just pointed out, called the meeting very constructive and said that the discussion included the prospects of strategic cooperation between the US and Russia. Now, exactly what that cooperation looks like isn't clear, but what is also clear is the fact that no breakthrough has come from this meeting, at least not as we've seen reported. What we've seen in the last few minutes, a reaction perhaps from the US president announcing 25% tariffs, new tariffs, on India for purchasing Russian oil. So already some pushback from the US administration following this meeting with Steve Witkoff. Clearly, if the sequence of events followed one after the other, Perhaps that meeting did not go so well. We'll have to wait and see for more of those details. But back to those tariffs on India, a significant move. And if you look at the language in the executive order signed by Donald Trump on these tariffs, it states very clearly that Russia's actions here in Ukraine are a threat to American national security. Now, that kind of language would have been unthinkable for Ukrainians, for people around the world looking at the US position just a few months ago. So there is a shift in language, there is a shift in posture, new tariffs being imposed on India for buying Russian oil. And although this meeting with Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin would have been well seen here with a rather large degree of skepticism, there is perhaps a little bit of optimism in that changing US posture.
All right, so we'll have to see how that develops. In the meantime, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And staying on the topic, Donald Trump is imposing an additional 25% tariff on goods from India. The U.S. president signed an executive order on Wednesday citing India's direct or indirect imports of Russian oil. The new tariff is set to take effect in 21 days on August 27th. From that date, nearly all Indian imports will face tariffs of 50% or more. In a document released by the White House, Trump also reaffirmed existing sanctions against Russia, stating that the Russian government's actions continue to pose a significant threat to the United States' national security and foreign policy in connection with the war in Ukraine. The European Commission has welcomed Ukraine's appointment of a new economic security chief. The positive response followed nearly 2 weeks of pressure from Brussels following the temporary curbing and eventual reinstatement of two key anti-corruption bodies in the war-torn country. Our EU correspondent Angela Skujins has more.
On Wednesday, the Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko announced that someone, after weeks of backroom dealings, has finally been appointed to head up Ukraine's Economic Security Bureau. The person that was properly vetted and successfully passed a polygraph test is Alexander Tsvedzinski. Now, this individual is a former anti-corruption veteran as well as a detective whose job now is to oversee the agency which explores economic crimes, which is particularly important as Ukraine, where there's another year of Russian aggression. Brussels is welcoming the news, the most strident of the applause coming from the European Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Kos, who posted on social media platform X that this is a good step for Ukraine's EU accession bid. However, she reiterated that the reforms must not stop there. We heard the European Commission state at the tail end of last week, after those two key anti-corruption institutions had their powers restored, that more anti-corruption reforms are required. They listed this as a specific example, as well as appointing 4 judges to oversee the Constitutional Court, as well as a litany of other issues. We'll have to wait and see now whether more reforms are planned by that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, if this will ramp up as he wants to accelerate his EU accession bid. We also know that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has stated that she wants Ukraine to join the EU family by the end of the decade. So hopefully the reforms don't stop here. Angela Skujins from Brussels for TVP World.
A Georgian court has sentenced journalist Mizia Amagopili to 2 years in prison for slapping a police chief during an anti-government protest last October. Amagopili, who found 2 independent media outlets in Georgia, was convicted in Batumi, the country's second-largest city, for violence against a public order officer. In a surprise move, the judge downgraded the charge from assaulting a police officer to a lesser offense, resulting in a lighter sentence. Her sentencing has drawn international criticism. 24 Western diplomatic missions, including the EU, Canada, the UK, issued a joint statement condemning what they called growing intimidation of journalists in Georgia. And with that, we conclude this edition of World News. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.